So I am Tom Merrill. I'm the director of Lincoln Scholars, and I just want to welcome you. I see a lot of friendly faces here, so we're really happy about that. And I also want to say, before we begin, a big thank you to Sunyata Corey, who is the program who actually does all the work to make everything work in the program. So we just want to say thank you to her. You guys know that, I'm going to make this very short, higher education is a moment of crisis. People are very scared. In fact, I believe there was a faculty protest just 2 days ago in front of SIS. You can read about it in the Eagle. And there are good reason for people to be scared. There are lots of things going on that I won't go into. It might seem like a counterintuitive thing to say that Cortex education might be part of the answer of how higher education can push back against the things that are happening. Perhaps not in a short-term kind of way, but in a medium-term or a long-term kind of way. I know that many, maybe I should say 99% of my colleagues would not agree with me in saying that. And yet, I believe that to be the case. So I'm just going to say that. Our speaker today knows a lot about these topics. Roosevelt Montas is now the newly appointed John and Margaret Bard Professor of Liberal Education and Civic Life. That's a great title, Roosevelt, that somebody should seal, at Bard College. But before that, he was from 2008 until 2018. He was the director for the core curriculum at Columbia University. You guys who follow these kinds of curricular issues will know that Columbia is one of the few places that has tried to preserve a core text curriculum. We could talk about what the pros and the cons of that are later on. But Roosevelt was one of the people who was in the trenches trying to do that. As you know, Lincoln Scholars is a core text curriculum. We're not trying to be exactly like Columbia, but we certainly have taken a lot of inspiration from what they do and inspiration from how they think about things. So Roosevelt is also the best-selling author of this book. It must be best-selling. Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. He is a national leader in terms of making the case for liberal education, which we need more than ever. And so for that, we're grateful to him, but also grateful that he's been a friend of the program and somebody who's helped us think about the world. So he's a great friend to us. So please join me in welcoming Roosevelt, who is going to talk about themes from his book and Columbia. Perhaps you can tell us what's going on in Columbia, like why is Columbia think so much? But
Columbia thinks so much.
Hey, thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. Over to you, Roosevelt.
Yeah, Columbia stinks. Tom, really, thank you for having me here. Tom and I go back many years of working together, scheming, conspiring, doing things that often brings upon us general disapproval of our colleagues, sometimes approval. And I'm a huge fan of this program, as you might gather. And it's a pleasure to be here in person. I've spoken here, but on Zoom. So it's really great to be here in person. And thank you all for showing up on a Friday afternoon. I was not told about this retreat or invited to this retreat. But I'll take anything that encourages people to come. They have this folder here where I was carrying my talk from Duke University, with which I have no association except as I was there 2 weeks ago. And when I was there giving a talk, it was on a Thursday evening, and it was a Thursday evening before spring break. So what they did to make people come was they had a big party, a ball, like a formal after my talk. And that's how they made people come. And now you have a retreat. And I'm going to spread that model around of having some kind of party or fun thing right after my talks. But really, thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon to talk and think together about. I'm going to hold this so that I can move a little bit. To talk and think together a little bit about the character of this endeavor that we are engaged in. This endeavor, this educational endeavor that is situated inside an institution, inside a college, inside a bachelor's degree, but which is an endeavor that really has more to do with you as an individual, with the student as a developing life, than it does with a credential, than it does with credits, than it does with a diploma. It is that part of your education that sometimes we call liberal education. And that's essentially what I want to put some thoughts before you about, and then maybe engage you in conversation. Um, that's what my book is about, Rescuing Socrates. That book sort of has three strands. One of them is autobiographical. Um, the subtitle is How the Great Books Changed My Life. So the book is a kind of honest reckoning with the way in which my life was shaped by the experience of liberal education. Um, the reason I wanted to tell that story is because by accident, the way that my life has turned out, the way that my life has unfolded, has been very distinctly shaped and oriented by liberal education. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I grew up in the Dominican Republic, in a small rural town, and I came to New York, came to the United States to New York when I was a teenager, well, right before my 12th birthday, so technically a preteen. And I didn't speak English, and I went to New York City public schools, and it was the distance from there to sort of academia is far. And my life offers a very stark example of what a liberal education can do for a life, for an individual. But a liberal education can do the same thing for a life, for an individual, even if they don't come from what we might call a marginalized background or a disadvantaged background. But choosing to tell some of the story of my life puts the focus on a particular thing about liberal education. And liberal education is about your life. Liberal education is about transforming or enabling the unfolding of your life. In liberal education, we often read books, we look at art, we have discussions, we have debates, we do a lot of reading, we do a lot of writing. And sometimes that can lead people to think that what a liberal education consists of is the mastery or the acquaintance with a particular set of texts and a particular set of skills. And those texts and those skills are certainly central to the project. But really what a liberal education consists of is a, is a inner development. The education, it concerns an inner development that happens in the student. A kind of an inner unfolding that happens in the students. And and that is really, really hard to like measure. That's really, really hard to assess. Sometimes when I teach in a core class at Columbia, to do every year, I mean, which I have done every year. I'm about to start teaching in the core at college. But I tell my students, if at the end of the semester, I'm going to give you a grade. But if I were being honest about what grade I was going to give you, I would give it incomplete. And maybe 20 years from now, if you come back to your college reunion or something, we can sit down and have a conversation, and we can think about the ways in which what we do in this class played out in the way that you lived your life. And then I can give you a grade. But I have to give you a grade at the end of the semester, so I'm going to do that. But what I try to transmit and communicate by saying that is that a liberal education is fundamentally organized around the question that Socrates asked at the beginning of the Republic. The way he phrased it was, what whole way of life is most worthwhile for each of us to live? That is the cardinal, foundational question of a liberal education. It is an education that is aimed at equipping you and giving you the tools with which to think most productively and most deeply about what kind of life is most worthwhile for you to live. And it's significant that at the heart of liberal education, there's a question. And there are a lot of ways in which you can formulate that question. What is a good life? What does it mean to be human? Et cetera, et cetera. But what there is at the heart of liberal education is a set of questions, not a set of answers. And part of the reason why it's a set of questions rather than a set of answers is because it's liberal. Because it is a form of education that is anchored on a recognition of our condition of freedom. And I'll speak a little bit about what I mean by that, by our condition of freedom. I was at Catholic University yesterday, talking about education, and after my talk, went out, had dinner with a small group that included some students, and one of the students asked me at the dinner, "What if you feel that you know what the answer is to the fundamental questions of life? How do you then teach liberal education? Or can you then teach liberal education?" And I kind of swallowed hard and I said, liberal education is neutral with respect to the outcome of the fundamental questions. If you are teaching liberal education as a way to transmit the answer to the fundamental questions, you're not doing liberal education, you're doing something called indoctrination. It is as legitimate an outcome of a liberal education to somebody ends up an atheist communist as it is a legitimate outcome of a liberal education that someone ends up an ascetic spiritual leader. Those are both manifestations, those can both be manifestations of an awakened life, of a life that is examined, that is the product of deliberation and self-reflection. So self-reflection, one of the aspects of our freedom is, I think, captured in our capacity for self-reflection.
What's his name?
Freedom, freedom is complicated, and like George Orwell said in Animal Farms, that some animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Same goes with freedom. All people are free, but some people are more free than others. In practice, exercising your freedom requires material resources. So there are some people that are born in socioeconomic conditions or in political situations and cultural configurations that dramatically reduce their scope of free, self-governed, autonomous activity. Even in our society, depending on how you were born, where you were born, who your parents are, you may have a very dramatically different scope for freedom. And not only that, not only is our freedom sort of constrained and circumscribed by the circumstances of our birth, but we are hedged in on every side by historical contingency, by biological imperatives that we're born with. Everywhere that we look, we are constrained and channeled in particular ways. But that doesn't impact or reduce some other ways in which we are fundamentally, inescapably, and irreducibly free. And one of them is our capacity for self-reflection. When you reflect on yourself, when you exercise this weird, extraordinary, mysterious, and ultimately incomprehensible capacity to look at yourself, right? It's the fundamental mystery that we live with is this thing. The fundamental mystery that we live with, and it's a mystery that is
that is resistant to explanation is the fact of our self-awareness, the fact of consciousness. It's the fact that we are here and we are somehow awake, right? Somebody flipped a switch that made you aware of yourself and aware of yourself as an aware being. As far as we know, no other being has that. There are different kinds of awareness, and you can make an argument that awareness exists in a kind of continuum. That animals have different sorts of awareness. You know, many animals clearly have lots of the same sense perceptions that we do: sight and sound and smell and touch. Special mammals very similar to us, but even if there is a continuum, there's a break there. There's a big leap that happens between other forms of cognition, as far as we can tell, and the kind of cognition that we have. That leap is related to language. Nothing in nature approximates the kind of complexity, hierarchical organization, grammatical and syntactical organization, language faculty that we have. Nothing in the universe, as far as we know, approximates this very strange existential condition of self-awareness. One of the sort of paradoxes or strangeness about self-awareness is that when you look at yourself, when you become aware of yourself, what is it that is becoming aware of what? That is, when you see yourself, who is it that's doing the seeing?
Justice
And
without
what is the object that is being seen?
possible concept.
And you get into this paradox because the thing that is doing the seeing is also part of what you see. And part of the reason we can't ultimately am I out of view from the camera? So am I okay? Right? Yeah. Part of the reason why we can't ultimately explain consciousness is because we can't stand outside of it. It's because you can't point to consciousness as an object of cognition. You can't point to consciousness and self-awareness as an object of reflection. So reflection involves this doubling on itself of our awareness. There's a line in James Joyce's Ulysses where Stephen Dedalus says, thought is the thought of thought. Thought is the thought of thought. And one of the things that this capacity that we have for self-examination, for self-reflection, for looking and examining ourselves, is that activity of self-reflection changes you. That is, that in the act of seeing yourself, you are transformed into something else. The act of seeing yourself already turns you into something different than what you were before you looked. And that capacity for self-reflection and the transformative impact that self-reflection has on you is one of the ways in which we're free. Because that capacity for self-reflection, you probably know Socrates' probably famous line, something that he says in the Apology when he's defending himself before the Athenian jury. He says, you know, the Athenians say to him, okay, Socrates, if you stop doing this annoying thing that you do all the time, that you call philosophizing, where you go around asking questions and digging around in the most sort of sensitive and fundamental kinds of questions. What is justice? What is piety? What is love? What is truth? How do you know that you know something? What is the nature of political power? All of these questions that you keep raising, if you just stop doing that, just act normal, just be a normal person, we'll let you off the hook. This death sentence that we, are on the verge of imposing on you, will let you go. And Socrates says, I can't do that. And he says, I can't do that. And one of the reasons he says he can't do that is, he says, because the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. And that's a hard statement because it means that there are certain according to Socrates, right? What Socrates is claiming is that there is a certain kind of unthinking life that is not worth living. That somehow the act of self-examination adds a worth, adds a value, adds a dignity that is irreducible. It can be exchanged for something else. It consists in what Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, called dignity. Immanuel Kant said, that everything in the world has a price that is an equivalent that it can be exchanged for, except dignity. Dignity is that thing to which there isn't an equivalent in a market economy. And what confers dignity from us is a rational, a self-aware, a thinking capacity. It has no equivalent. You know, how many chickens equal a human life? There ain't a number of chickens. It's not a comparable thing. And you might I say that from a very kind of Western centric perspective, because there are traditions that recognize all life as fundamentally equal. And there is something very, very powerful about that. Not the Kantian point of view, it's not the Platonic point of view, but it is a very profound and I think consequential point of view that I don't want to sort of dismiss or not acknowledge. But this notion that Kant articulates and that Socrates articulates about the examined life, about this capacity that we have for self-reflection, that confers something on us that is of irreducible value, that has no equivalent in an economy of exchange. Um, the unexamined life is not worth living. Another implication of that statement is that your life is not fully transparent and accessible to you. That is, that there is such a thing as an examined life, and there is such a thing as an unexamined life, that your life is a worthwhile, a legitimate object of investigation. We can go through life deceived, deluded into thinking that we're fully transparent to ourselves, that we are fully present to ourselves, that we know ourselves entirely. But it turns out that we are a mystery to ourselves. And that's something, one of the chapters in my book is on Freud. And it's something that Freud really took and ran away with. And Freud develops the idea of psychoanalysis really around the notion, his central, what he calls discovery, although this idea has been around for a long time. Freud theorized it and thought about it very deeply. But the central discovery, as Freud puts it, is the unconscious. That is, that in our mental life, there are vast regions that are inaccessible to us that we don't see. It's like, like your nose or something. You can't see your nose. I mean, if you twist your eyes, you might see like a little shape of it, but you can't see it, and you can't see your face. You can see your face in the mirror, obviously, and you can see other people's faces directly, but you can't see your face directly. Mental life is full of these vast regions that are actually inaccessible to us. And then there are some times that they sort of peek through. And, when I first encountered Freud in college, the first thing that arrested my attention was a thing that a teacher said, this is before I had ever heard, this is the first time I heard of Freud and before I had ever read any Freud. But this teacher associated Freud with this claim, this thing he said, that according to Freud, he said, the reasons that we give ourselves for the things that we do are never the real reasons. The reasons that we give ourselves for the things that we do are never the real reasons. Now, Freud, it is indeed a very Freudian statement, and part of the problem with Freud that I think has brought him out of favor is that he loved to make this extreme, radical statements. The reasons that we give ourselves for doing what we do are never the real reasons. That's the way he puts it. Never the real. But whether you accept that extreme claim that they're never the real reasons, I think that you can recognize that many times, the reasons that we give ourselves for the things that we do are not the real reasons. And if you examine your life, you will realize that there are decisions that you made to date somebody, to break up with somebody, to choose a major, to dress in a certain way, to listen to a certain kind of music, to go to a certain college. Lots of decisions that we make, that when we make them, we tell ourselves and we tell others, these are the reasons why I'm making this decision. And then 5 years later, 6 years later, 10 years later, you look back and say, there was something else going on there. That was not really why I did what I did, why I decided what I decided, why I thought. But the real reasons I couldn't bring myself to accept, I couldn't bring myself to grapple with. Our life is riddled with things like that. Our um, our self-awareness, our what Freud would call the conscious, the ego, the conscious part of our mind that is fully present to itself is only a small part of what's going on. It's one of the ways in which you can understand the possibility for an examined life. The possibility that you can scrutinize your intentions, scrutinize your heart, scrutinize your mind, and actually be able to discover things about yourself that you did not know before. This is a crazy thing, that you can discover things about yourself that you did not know before by the act of self-examination. And when you discover those things about yourself that you did not know before, the person that you are is a different person then. That is the act of self-reflection, the act of insight, the act of self-discovery transforms you, and it transforms you in ways that are unpredictable, in ways that are incalculable. You don't know where you're going to end up when you undertake the act of honest self-reflection. And it's something that you do as a student. If you're a serious student, that is, if you are in fact committed to the project of self-knowledge, it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of guts, because you prepare yourself, you undertake this thing of facing yourself and possibly becoming someone else, possibly encountering aspects of yourself or understandings about your reality that fundamentally challenge who you thought you were, commitments that you had, beliefs that you had, and you take the risk, a high risk of becoming something else. This is something that happens in education a lot, and probably you have experienced it. You know, you go away from to college and you go back 6 months later, a year later, 4 years later, and your parents find that you've become a different person. Friends find that you've become a different person. You might find that you've become a different person. You take that risk. If you go through college or through any intense educational experience and you end up the same person just with more knowledge, I think you've wasted your time. That is just with knowing more facts, just with more information. Education, liberal education, is transformative in this way. Liberal education is a kind of education that transforms who you are. I want to point to one other aspect of freedom, right? I listed a bunch of ways in which we're not free. And one way in which we're free is in this capacity for self-reflection that everybody has, no matter how poor you are, no matter how uneducated you are, no matter how disadvantaged you are, no matter how marginalized you are. This capacity is an inborn endowment that you come into the world with. And we know, stories by the dozens, by the hundreds of people that were able to tap into this capacity and engage in this process of self-transformation and engage in a kind of flourishing, a kind of deepening, a kind of flowering that is enabled by the process. That even in situations of the most severe material deprivation, they end up with lives of richness, of meaning, of purpose, of what we might call flourishing. This is one of the things that really caught my attention when I first encountered Socrates. I had come from the Dominican Republic when I was about to turn 12. I had a very rough first couple of years. I came with my older brother. My mother, who lived in the United States, had petitioned for us. We came, I was about to be 12, my brother was 17. My mother had a minimum wage job in a factory in Brooklyn. She lost that job shortly after we came. It was a downsizing in that factory. So she ended up without a job. My brother, we couldn't pay the rent. My brother and I ended up living in a basement room of a distant relative who we didn't really know. A couple of years after that, my brother got a full-time job. I got a part-time job. We were able to get enough money together to rent an apartment and reunite with her mother. And this was when I was a sophomore in high school. That year, as a sophomore in high school, I had been in the United States now 4 years, and my English had advanced quite a lot in 4 years. And people next door to me threw out a bunch of books one evening, and I went and picked out a couple of them. They were among the books they threw away. There were some really beautiful editions, and I picked up two books from a series that you can still find around. It's called the Harvard Universal Classics. It's like these gilded edged, hardbound, fake leather, but leather looking. The kind of stuff that you often see like in backgrounds or rich people's houses, lining bookshelves, or at least in the olden times. Anyway, they're beautiful books. So I picked up two of them, brought them with me. One, I recognized the name Shakespeare on the spine. I brought that with me. I couldn't read it. It was Shakespeare. I could speak English. And then the other one was Plato. And the dialogues of Plato that were in that volume were the last sort of dialogues that record the last days of Socrates' life. The apology, the credo, the apology, the Phaedo. The credo, the apology is his trial, and the credo is his dialogue he has with a friend of his right after the trial, after he has been condemned to death, and the friend has sort of an escape plan for Socrates. Socrates declines. Socrates chooses to accept the death penalty rather than flee. And then the Phaedo is a record of his last day of life, where he makes a big, elaborate, and to my mind, unconvincing argument for the immortality of the soul. But in the apology, one of the things that really struck me, one of the things that really sort of gripped my attention, was this notion that there is a way of living your life that has a kind of dignity, a power, a beauty, a depth that you can attain regardless of the material disadvantages that you may have. See, I was not so stupid that I didn't realize that I was poor. I was not so stupid that I didn't realize that I had disadvantages and that I was locked out, at least at that moment, from the mainstream of American culture, from sort of the tools and paths for social advancement. And it was like discovering this treasure. It was like discovering this thing that there was this form of, there was this way of life that was perfectly accessible to me, that nobody could take away from me, that had this extraordinary value, that had this extraordinary wealth, that had this extraordinary dignity attached to it. I was on my way to point out this other aspect of freedom, besides this capacity for self-reflection. This other aspect of freedom, besides the capacity for self-reflection, which, like self-reflection, everybody has, and you have, comes from the fact that each one of us, each one of you, must determine for yourselves what whole way of life is most worth living for you. Right? It's that fundamental question of liberal education. No one can decide that for you. You can have role models, you can have traditions that put forth ideas about what the right kind of life is, the most worthy kind of life is, but you have to decide. You have to posit for yourself some vision, some idea, a notion of what the good life is, and try to organize your life according to that. It is a practical, inescapable aspect of our condition of freedom. That you have to organize your life in such a way that will produce the most satisfying, the most flourishing, the happiest life. You've got these two aspects of your freedom: self-reflection, the necessity of modeling and organizing your life in some way, according to some notion, some organizing principle that, to your mind, to the best of your knowledge, is going to produce the worthiest kind of life for you to live. Now, the worthiest kind of life for you to live might be different than the worthiest kind of life for me to live, right? The worthiest kind of life for me to live might be as an ascetic, as a monk in a cave, meditating or praying every day. The most
worthwhile life for you to live might be as a capitalist making a lot of money.
At least you might think that that's the most worthwhile kind of life.
I think maybe it's much worth kind of life,
Or it may be as a communist social justice warrior, whatever, right? But each one of us has to set our path with some North Star, with some sense of that's the direction in which I'm headed. A liberal education is meant to equip you,
to give you tools.
with which to navigate that question in the most authentic, the most enriching way. That's why it's called a liberal education, because it is an education that recognizes and is built on this condition of freedom that you have.
There's another aspect of freedom besides these two that I've highlighted, having to do with self-reflection and deciding what whole way of life is most worthwhile for each of us to live.
And that has to do with what we might loosely call political freedom. That is the kind of freedom that obtains in a collective. And that idea of freedom, the kind of freedom that is possible in a collective, in a social organization,
Is actually the heart of the origins of liberal education.
liberal education, as you probably know,
Loosely speaking, starts in ancient Athens.
that's where we have the first sort of
Systematic, serious thinking and theorizing
about this form of education that from back then it's been called liberal education. That's the term that is used, and that's the term that I prefer, even though liberal education today in our political environment is kind of poisoned. That is, people's first thought is that a liberal education
it involves being a political liberal,
which is a fine thing to be, but it's not what liberal education is about. But that idea has such a strong resonance in our culture, and in part is that universities are dominated by people who are politically liberal. And that experience I alluded to before, a kid going to school and coming back to college, a lot of families, sort of either middle of the road or conservative families, have the experience of sending their kids to college and having a very liberal person return from the influences in the college campuses. So that reinforces this idea that la liberal education is this political, woke, left, progressive education. But that's not what a liberal education means. The term liberal education is way older than that political divide under which we live right now.
reason why I like that term and continue to use it is because it captures
In a way that the alternatives to that term, like classical education or general education or humanities education, does not capture the fact that liberal education concerns this condition of freedom, this condition that we have as free human beings. How do you educate a free human being? How do you educate a being, an agent that has this capacity to self-shape, to self-compose, and that has this quality that we call dignity, this quality that is of irreducible value to us? How do you educate a being for that condition of freedom? So back to 5th century Athens. 5th century Athens is a democracy, one of the first, maybe the first democracy that we know a lot about. And democracy is kind of a crazy idea that people are going to self-govern. It is, for the most part, it hasn't worked in human history.
most of human history. Most people have lived under
Despotic, autocratic, strictly hierarchical political regimes, political structures. That's been the rule of thumb for humanity. And even today in our world, even though we live in America, probably most of us in this room are Americans,
democracy just seems like the air we breathe.
I mean, lately we have been worried about
What our democracy is becoming or threats to the norms that have sustained
our democracy as far as we have had it. Some people are really afraid that this democracy will go the way of so many other democracies, which is that they transmute themselves into some kind of authoritarian, tyrannical, despotic form of rule. But Athens comes up with this and sustains for quite a while very successfully this crazy idea that people should be self-governing, that everybody, the common person, should have a say, an equal say, everyone an equal say in matters of governance, that political power will somehow be distributed equally among all, and that we will come together and put our voices, our opinions, our perceptions, our ideas, our visions of what we should be. We'll aggregate them all together. We will, through voting and mechanisms of deliberation, we'll come up with the one decision that then we're all going to stick to and we're all going to do. Now, a note about Athenian democracy is that we call Athens a democracy, and when we call Athens a democracy, we actually use the rhetorical cognitive operation that we call metonymy, which is where we take a part for the whole. You know, when you call like a business person a suit, we just take the part and use it to name the whole. We do that when we talk about Athens as a democracy, because Athens, only one part of Athens is democratic. Athens is a slave society. As you probably know, throughout history, slavery and democracy go together. Most democracies, including our own, have been slave democracies. And so democracy only applies to that portion of the population that is involved in self-governance. So when I say that Athens is a democracy, I want to put an asterisk there just to remind you that when we say about democracy, it's like when you look at an iceberg and you see the tip and you say that's the iceberg. But there's this whole other thing underneath that's actually also the iceberg. And the part that you see cannot exist without the one that's underneath there. But taking Athens, that portion of Athens that we call a democratic Athens, in which every citizen had to participate in shaping their collective destiny. Every citizen took a part, played a part in decision making, held political office at random. They would do a lottery to assign political office. So when it was your turn to serve political office, you served political office. Everyone participated in jury trials were these massive juries. The jury that convicted Socrates and condemned him to death was 501 people. Every citizen served in the army. Every citizen participated in formulating like foreign policy. Are we going to go to war or are we not? Are we going to impose sanctions? Are we not going to impose sanctions? How big an army are we going to have? What part of our budget is going to be dedicated to the army? What are going to be the rules for the army? Are we going to let women in the army? Who's going to pay for their equipment? How many ships are we going to build? How are we going to train this whole? Everybody had to participate and make decisions about these matters of collective governance. So liberal education emerged as the kind of education that would prepare the Athenian citizens to play a role in the deliberative process of self-governance. Liberal education was sort of free. Liberal education was about self-governance. And there, at its moment of conception, liberal education had to do particularly with collective self-governance, with those capacities, those skills, and that knowledge base that would best equip you to participate in that deliberative process. Now, deliberating in democracy is hard. Deliberating in democracy is tricky. You need to be able to listen well. You need to be able to be persuasive, of course, and you have to listen well in order to be persuasive. In order to be persuasive, you have to be able to imagine yourself on the other side. You need to be able to look at the world through the person you want to persuade eyes and think of what would be convincing and compelling from that point of view, not from your own. So there is this effective relational capacity that you have to develop in order to be an effective persuader. So you have to be able to listen. You have to be able to articulate yourself clearly. You have to be able to understand nuanced problems and do and perform some very complicated sort of cost benefit analyses. If we do that, we can't do that. And you have to be able to think about the long-term consequences of policies that you adopt. Sometimes to be able to have a functioning collective self-governance, you have to prefer collective interest to your own. As you have to put the interest of the whole ahead of your own. Sometimes you have to choose long-term benefits and short-term pain. You can't always choose the thing that is most immediately beneficial. You have to take into account the long range, and sometimes you have to choose the long range benefit over the benefit of the the immediate future. Sometimes you have to think about the benefit of others, about the benefit of your descendants. When you're making a decision, you're also making a decision for that. So there's this whole very complicated universe in which you have to enact your citizenship, your self-governance. So think about what kinds of things, what kind of education you're going to organize for an individual whose job in the city is going to be to participate in this collective self-governance. That was liberal education. And liberal education was contrasted to slave education. Education for the slave was going to be an education that was going to be narrowly applied to whatever scope of activity they were involved in. If they were a field hand, a field slave, they were going to learn about agriculture and when to plant and when to water. And if they were a household slave, they may have to learn household things like maybe cooking or maybe cleaning or maybe managing or maybe rearing of children. And that kind of education that was specific to a task was what came to be called servile education. And today we don't call it servile education. Today we don't call it slave education. Today we call it professional education or technical education or vocational education, applied education, practical education. And there is no question that in our world in which, as opposed to the slave democracy of Athens, where many of the free people actually didn't have to work. Many of the free people had enslaved people doing the work and generating the material basis for their own lives. So their main preoccupation, or their principal preoccupation, could be matters of collective affairs. In our society, it doesn't work like that. In our society, we have, first of all, a representative democracy, a republican form of government, not a direct democracy the way they did in Athens, but also the expectation that each one of us is going to make a living for ourselves, that each one of us is going to have a job, that we're going to take one portion of our lives and develop skills that are specialized and that are valued in our market economy. And through the exercise of those skills, in particular, narrow, circumscribed context, we're going to generate the material means of our livelihood. That's a deal that we have in this epoch of history, of human history in our culture. So clearly, college needs to do that. An education needs to equip you for that also responsibility of producing the means of your subsistence. And that part of the education is the technical, pragmatic, applied, professional education. There still remains that other part of your education, the part of the education that is concerned not with how you will make a living, but how you will live your life, right? One of my favorite quotes in ever is from W.E.B. Du Bois, who says the true college will ever have one goal, not to earn meat, but to learn the aim and purpose of the life that meat sustains. Right? Not the true college. True college. Its purpose is not to earn meat, but to learn the aim and purpose of the life that meat sustains. That idea of the college, that idea that that is the purpose, the true purpose of the university, the true purpose of the college, persists today in higher education, but under constant threat, under constant attack, and in most places is pursued very poorly and very badly. One of the reasons why it's pursued poorly and badly in higher education is because the university is organized along disciplinary, departmental, specialized areas. So we have, for example, in the universities, a whole section that's called the liberal arts disciplines. And in the liberal arts disciplines, you have art history and philosophy and literary studies, history, and those liberal arts disciplines which exist in the university are often conflated with a liberal education. But a liberal education, in fact, has nothing to do with a liberal arts major. A liberal arts major is a specialized course of study just as much as engineering is a specialized course of study. And when you study art history, you're being taught art history by art historians. And what sets the curriculum and what dictates what the major covers is as if you were preparing to go to graduate school to get a PhD in art history, which most people who major in art history are not. But that's what organizes is this professional, specialized pursuit of art history. But you know, the questions, the fundamental questions of liberal education do not exist inside disciplines. They are way more fundamental. They're interdisciplinary. And art history and literature and philosophy and history all speak and contribute to the question. If you're going to study liberally, it makes absolutely no sense. It is a kind of oxymoron to major in a liberal art. That's not what liberal education is. Um, Obviously, there's a significant overlap because liberal education, because of its concern with the human condition and the human condition of freedom, is going to focus on human creation. It's going to focus on the things that explore and express our humanity in their most free way, their most free form. And it's a funny thing that the way that when our humanity is free, when our humanity expresses itself freely, that is, it expresses itself in a non-utilitarian way. You express your freedom and your humanity not in the pursuit of some particular end, but simply as an expression of freedom. What you end up is with stuff. Is with stuff like art. It's with stuff like literature. It's with stuff like music. Stuff that simply expresses some inner capacity, some inner longing, some inner reality that expresses, articulates, unfolds something deep about you, but does not have a utilitarian end in view. That is not subordinated to some practical goals and practical achievement. So clearly, when you're going to study liberal education and you're going to look at the ways in which human beings have expressed and explored that condition of freedom, you are going to end up with a lot of this stuff that is covered in the liberal arts disciplines. But it's a fundamentally different project. And that's why a liberal education is the kind of education, sometimes we call it general education instead of inside academia lingo, because it is a kind of education that ought to be central to every college degree. Not just the liberal arts major, the engineer, the computer scientist, the pre-med, the business student. Every college student ought to have a significant liberal education. Regardless of the profession, should be liberal education first. And on top of that, then a professional organization. So programs like the Lincoln Scholars programs are rare, programs in which students study a whole range of things. You study philosophy, you study literature, you study social thought, you study history. Because the issues that we're dealing with, the debates that we're engaging in, are of a more fundamental character. They're pre-disciplinary. I want to read a quote. I know it's been going on for a while now. I'm just going to read this quote for I open up for questions. This is from Frederick Douglass's life, narrative of the life of an American slave. One of my favorite quotes because it illustrates something fundamental about liberal education. Frederick Douglass was from the eastern shore of Maryland. That's where Suñata is from. He was born on a plantation there, obviously enslaved. When he was about 8 years old, he was sent to live in Baltimore, big city. And he was sent there to a household that had a little boy about his age. That's why he was sent there. That household was headed by the brother of his legal owner back in the Eastern Shore. And Douglas was sent to Baltimore to be sort of a companion to this little boy, and a household slave. When Douglas gets there, about 8 years old, this passage that I'm going to read happens, and the N word is here, that derogatory slur. So I'm not going to say that word because it's a word that has become so indecent in our contemporary sort of sensibility, so offensive. But
you should know that it's here and that it's here used in that same offensive, dehumanizing way for which we avoid it today. So I'm gonna replace that N word with the word slave, but you'll be able to tell where it appears. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a slave an inch, he will take an L. We have a version of that saying now, if you give someone an inch, they'll take a mile. An L is like a corner of a house. A slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart and called into existence a new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. See, notice that Douglas has been wondering why all the white people are the ones who are masters and why all the black people are the ones who are enslaved. He knows them intimately. He knows that the black people are not weaker, stronger, dumber than the white people. They're not stronger, they're not better, they're not smarter. Yet it's all the white people who enslaved the black people. And I can't figure out why that is. And here he says, for the first time, I understood the nature of that power. And then he adds, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Notice that the power of literacy, the power of learning, can both be a liberatory force and a force for the subjugation and exploitation of others, right? It's a double-edged sword. Douglas says, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. So the last aspect of liberal education I want to highlight is that, like Thomas Auld says, that learning will do Douglas, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. That liberal education today is meant also to make you unfit to be enslaved. That there are forms of subjugation and coercion and domination that pervade the way that we live, that pervade the marketplace. There are forms of enslavement. The ancients used to talk about a form of enslavement called wage slavery, for example, in which somebody sold their labor and for a period of time became subject to a master. And in antiquity, this form of slavery was thought to be beneath the dignity of any self-respecting person. Well, today's wage slavery is quite rife, and wage slavery, both of a low-paying kind, of the kind that many say undocumented farm workers experience, but there's also a form of wage slavery that's very high-paying. I know a lot of people who are highly paid wage slavery. Liberal education today is meant to also liberate you from forms of enslavement, domination, and coercion. Many of these are cultural impositions. Liberal education today is also meant to liberate you from the indecency and brutality of always doing things for profit. The indecency and brutality of always struggling to get ahead of other people, of succeeding at the expense of the defeat of others. These are brutal chains that restrict and distort our humanity. So liberal education today is meant to equip you for a kind of free life, a kind of liberation that will often cut against a lot of the cultural norms and a lot of the social norms that we live with and breathe.
And I see it as part, an essential ingredient, an essential component of the path toward broader, more widespread, and more universal liberation that I hope we're all engaged in. All right, I think I'll stop there and take questions. I'm sorry I've gone on so long. I lost track of time. I'd love some questions, comments. Tom, I don't know how much time we have.
We have until 4.
Okay, great. So questions and comments, okay? I'll repeat your question. Is that the best thing to do for
Yeah.
this, for the Zoom? Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Yeah,
It's often debated that modern primary education is sort of geared towards, as you were talking about, this sort of factory education, and to have people work more so for the purpose of labor and for practical education. And so usually what happens is, once again, it's debated that students go from this sort of education that's geared towards putting them into factories towards ideally this sort of liberal education that you see now. I was wondering if you would be able to comment on that, or if you something more specifically about whether you think that the role should be almost flipped, in that you should start with a liberal education within primary school and then later on tailor yourself more towards like specific, like you see in a primary education.
great, thank you. I'll try to summarize the question for anyone who's tuning to Zoom, but it's about the fact that primary education, I'm gonna say K through 12 education, has been described as organized on a factory model and focused on preparing workers, which means some basic skills, but also a kind of docility and obedience to irrational order. And that school is organized this way. Should we think of flipping it so that liberal education dominates the early schooling and then perhaps professional and applied education later in college, right?
Right.
I get it? Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot to that question. First of all, just the observation, which I agree with, that our educational system has been modeled in a kind of assembly line, industrial architecture that has very little relationship to the actual sort of developmental needs of the students, and with the idea of liberality. Now, that's sort of a template model. There are a lot of variations within that, and there are a lot of places that, in fact, pursue a liberal education in the K through 12 space. Now, liberal education in the K through 12 space is going to look very different than a liberal education at the college level. I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I think about liberal education a lot, and I think about parenting a lot, and I think about how I can educate these kids to cultivate and prepare them for the life of freedom. That is, how do I teach them in a way that honors, respects, recognizes, does not violate their freedom, but encourages and tools it for the kind of flourishing that they're capable of. Now, that looks different with my 3-year-old, my 7-year-old. My 7-year-old can already read, for example, and it's curious about science and curious and has a sort of a framework of understanding that to extend his education means one thing that it's very different than what it means for my 3-year-old. A lot of progressive education today, the thing that's called progressive education, Montessori, and sort of that line in elementary school, focus, for example, on play and free form exploration, right? That's liberal for that age group. It recognizes the spontaneity, freedom, to the extent that is safe, self-determination, self-sparking of that child, and teaches in a way that recognizes that freedom, that condition that even the 3-year-old and the 2-year-old has. So I could not agree more that liberal education needs to be something that we do in the entire educational curriculum. And in fact, there is a way in which it's more important that it be done in the K through 12 space and in the college space, because K through 12 is the universal education. And if we're going to have a real democracy, if we're going to have a democracy in which the citizens rule, right? If we're going to have democracy that in fact captures the idea of government by consent, right? You can't give consent if you're ignorant. Consent means informed consent. The only real consent is informed consent, and we know that. You can't have government by consent unless you have a population that is capable of being informed in the relevant matters of governance. So we need K through 12 education, and we need K through 12 education to be liberal. Now, some countries, and at least even some American schools, do a pretty good job doing a liberal K through 12 education. So then the other aspect of your question is whether then if we have a liberal education in the K through 12 space, could we then just focus higher education on professional pursuits? And that's sort of what's done in Europe, for example. There is no tradition of liberal education at the college level. You go into a university in Europe to be a doctor or a lawyer or an academic or an architect or whatever, and you only take classes related to that, and you only take classes with peers that are studying that. This idea of general education on a 4-year bachelor's degree that's non-professional, that really is an American thing. I think that there is a special and uniquely special value to liberal education at the college level. Because the college period, the traditional college period, that is, the 18 to 22 or so, which a lot of people go to college not in that age group, maybe even more people go to college not in that age group. But that period, I think has a really seminal, decisive, occupies a seminal and decisive developmental point in a human life, which is the point at which you separate yourself from your supervisors, from your tutors, from your mentors, from your governors, from your parents. And you begin to organize your life according to your own conceptions of who you are and who you want to be. That moment of sort of taking flight, that moment of differentiation and of assuming proper personhood, proper self-governance is incredibly fertile for the kind of exploration and debate and self-reflection that a liberal education encourages. So even if you've had a very good K-12 education that's liberal, I think that point of college is uniquely important, and the liberal education should be there as a foundation for whatever professional studies you pursue. It's brilliant and fortunate that the American system is the way it is, because there is a lane in the curriculum for liberal education, even though most universities have sold out that lane into just departmental courses. So that for most universities, your liberal part of your education or the general part of your education simply consists of taking courses in different disciplines, many of them liberal arts disciplines. As I have said, that's not really liberal education. And you can see that it's not liberal education in the results. Students in places like that tend not to have the kind of life transforming intellectual liberal experiences that students in the few places that do dedicated and self-aware liberal education have. Yeah.
I'm sure you're expecting this question about AI. So I'm wondering, there's a lot of pedagogical problems that AI is creating around liberal education. Do you think that liberal education should be isolated from AI entirely in its ideal form, or do you think that it should be incorporating and confronting the ethical and moral problems associated with AI to be fully effective?
Thank you. That's a great question about AI, right? And about whether AI should be factored out of liberal education and the liberal education sort of AI free, or whether liberal education should confront and encounter the ethical and philosophical all kinds of challenges that AI raises. Such a great question. AI, as you began your question by saying that AI is like wreaking havoc on liberal education or something like that, and that's true. But AI is reaching, I think, even deeper havoc in technical fields, like coding. Like people used to forget it, just become a coder, and that now actually not just a waste of time overall, right? I mean, it can become a very high level skill thing, the thing but it's not just about technical competence there. It's like a kind of aesthetic intuition and elegance. It's something else now that makes a coder, and some of that, that's shrinking. Also, the teaching of STEM fields, of mathematics, your problem sets ChatGPT can do. So it's not just in the liberal arts.
And it seems to me that the rise and increasing power of what we call artificial intelligence does generate philosophical and ethical questions of the deepest order. And that it is precisely the liberal arts that have any chance at confronting those questions in an alert and meaningful and sort of enlightened way. So it seems to me that absolutely liberal education needs to face and confront those issues. Now, as far as doing liberal education, I think that the rise of AI and the impact it's having on the way that pedagogy is done is to the advantage of liberal education. Because liberal education is precisely what we do. So, liberal education happens from person to person. Liberal education cannot be done in a mass way. That's why like MOOCs, the massive online open courses, you could never do liberal education that way because liberal education is not about an expert transmitting knowledge to you. Liberal education is about engaging in a process of investigation, in conversation, of shared exploration, with probably in the context of a university liberal education, with a kind of conductor, a kind of, the work of a liberal education teacher is something like a music conductor where you encourage certain parts, speed certain parts up, maybe add some context, create a certain mood and environment, and it'll be kind of a referee of conversation that also guides the conversation in certain directions without an end goal in view, except the richness of the conversation. It's a very ancient and low-tech thing. Like all you need for liberal education is a group of people and a prompt. The best kinds of prompts are, in my view, what we call the great books or the great, not just books, art, music, productions of human creativity and invention that have proved to be enduringly illuminating of what it means to be human. That stuff is the best, most productive kind of prompt. That's what you need. You need a book. I mean, sometimes like a chalkboard can be useful, but you don't need that. Liberal education happens through conversation and debate. So AI is not going to have a significant impact on that. It is going to have significant impact on other parts of what we do, like writing. I am trying to figure out how I use writing now and what writing is now, and what kinds of assignments I give and what I expect writing to do. I expect the writing to exercise in the students a certain kind of long form reasoning and a long form sort of rhetorical articulation of an argument, and that's persuasive and cogent. There's a kind of thinking, there's a whole set of kind of higher order cognitive capacities that I used writing to cultivate and develop and to be able to help the students. I can look at the writing and it's like an x-ray into their mind, right? Their writing tells me how they're thinking. And by working on their writing, I can work on their thinking. Ultimately, that's what we do when we teach writing. It's what we do is we teach thinking. And I just have no idea what that means now, how I teach that, because I can no longer simply rely on giving an assignment. I think it's out of the question for us to say, we're using a plan AI and say you can't use ChatGPT. First of all, it's unenforceable, but second, it's just not the world that we live in. We have to adapt to what that means, and which means that we have to understand what it means. Nobody yet understands what it means. Sam Altman doesn't understand what it means. We just don't. We're trying to figure it out. And the thing is running faster than our capacity to catch up. So the future is interesting. The future is going to be weird, really weird. Yeah.
Some Lincoln scholars were assigned to read the introduction of the part of chapter 1 of your book. And so.
Thank you, Tom, or thank you.
So my question is related to that. I'm looking down because I have a quote.
Okay.
That I want to pull out. In the introduction to your book, you wrote, comma quotation, "We do minority students an unconscionable disservice to steer them away from the traditional liberal arts curriculum. Yet that is too often what we are doing. We condescend them when we assume that that only work in which they find their ethnic or cultural identities affirmed can really illuminate their human experience." And then my question is, how do we abolish the myth that philosophy is by rich white men for rich white men? How do we undo the exclusivity that permeates academia?
Thank you. That's a great question. Academia has been, for most of its history, and it's old, right? The first institution of higher learning probably was Plato's Academy in the 5th century BC. And it has always been the province of a social elite, of a rarefied, exclusive cohort. Only really in the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War, with the GI Bill in the United States, did the idea of mass higher education sort of enter human history. The idea that
Higher education should be something for the common person.
for every man. Um,
There's a funny line
in Moby Dick, where Ishmael is like the main character in Moby Dick, and he's just like a kid in Manhattan. He's like depressed and aimless. So he says, I'm going to sign up for a waiting ship, or waiting. And he goes to into New Bedford, I think it is, or Nantucket, and he signs up for this whale ship called the Pequod. And the captain of the Pequod is Ahab, Captain Ahab, right? Madman. And when he's signing up for the ship owner who like signs the contract say, do you know that the captain of this ship is do you know about Ahab? And Ishmael's like, not really. And he says to Ishmael, he has been to colleges as well as among the savages, right? Because Ahab had lived or had been captured by savages, right? Native tribes in the Pacific. And he lived with them. And he also went to college. Going to college was as weird and as out of the ordinary as living, among the savages. So only after the Second World War do we have this idea of mass education. And it's an idea that just kept advancing. There were the field and the doors kept opening up. Now they've gone into reverse. I think we have reached the high water mark of access to college. And we reached that high water mark at a place that was far from satisfactory. But now what we're seeing is a clawing back. And I suspect that everyone in this room joins me in a commitment to push that forward. That is to reduce and eliminate the barriers to higher education and make it a more open and a more general and more universal experience rather than a lesser one. So that's college in general. And then within college, the study of liberal education has further been associated with a social elite. And the traditional liberal education curriculum, of course, skews towards the ancient. And when you go back to the ancient, the sources that exist, the sources that were created were by the elite. It isn't even, you can say from this society, we look at the European tradition, which is the one that has sort of shaped our norms, our institutions, our language, our literature, our aesthetic forms. You can't even say that it's white because they were all white. It is the elite of the society. It is the super privileged, well-resourced and elite of the society that produced all the stuff, and males, right? Because so that's something that we have to just contend with and grapple with and be alert with. We cannot do that. It reflects something important and something real about our history. And we can't make believe that that's not the way it was. In fact, if we want to understand why the world it is the way it is today, we better understand how it is that worked back then.
So it's not an argument for not reading it. It's not an argument for not engaging it.
Not only that,
Even elite, highly resourced people can have really good ideas.
and can say things that are very, very valuable and meaningful and illuminating.
And the reason why only a portion of the stuff that was produced in the past has survived and we find to be meaningful is because not everything that was produced in the past has that
Status. As I say there in the book, and you sort of allude to in the question, and I forgot to repeat your question.
I'm sorry, but I hope that by my answer, people can reconstruct what you were asking about. Is the fact that there is a left academic progressive tendency to think of that canon as merely patriarchal, white supremacist, imperialist, Eurocentric, exclusionary, and therefore to be somehow tainted and to be somehow complicit in forms of exclusion and oppression today we reject morally.
And obviously there is a point to that. I mean, read Aristotle's Politics and see what he says about slavery, see what he says about women. You know, that obviously the world that we have today, including many of the injustices that we that rankle and hurt and enrage us the most, of course, have a historical antecedent. But so have the movements of liberation and resistance against those forms of oppression. They also have an antecedent in history. And it is by reading those same texts that you can see how ideas of like gender equality, of the value of diversity, of the inherent freedom of individuals, of human rights, of non-doctrinaire, dogmatic investigation of the world. It is in that tradition, in that same tradition, that you see those liberatory impulses emerge and be debated and be theorized and implemented. so to deny people today
Who, like me,
are ethnic minorities,
who, like me, come from
communities that are dramatically,
drastically under-resourced, to deny them access to that tradition and to the kind of insight and understanding and empowerment that they bring to act as an effective agent in our society today, I think is criminal. And I think it's a huge, huge mistake. It doesn't mean that we also don't read works that resonate with our own cultural experience. We absolutely do. But to think that we do that instead and at the expense of this other thing is to do an incredible disservice and to in fact reinforce the mechanisms of exclusion. Because it used to be the white supremacists that used to have that argument. That Shakespeare, and it's Thomas Paul saying that learning would spoil the best slave. It's Thomas Paul saying keep that stuff away from them. Today,
a related argument is being made by people from the left, which and I think is
really really lamentable.
Asking what I think is a bit of a follow-up to that. Why do you think there's such an urge among the contemporary academic left to actively deny access to the canon or ignore the canon versus democratize it, confront it, take it out and say, let's read this, let's see why we should.
Yeah. That's a good question. Why is there?
I don't know. I'll propose a hypothesis, which is that
people like me were,
in some cases by force, in some cases by law, and in some cases just by convention, prevented from access to that type of education. That canon was sort of excluded and preserved for what in the language of sort of the left radical academia would be called the oppressors. It was the education of the oppressors. And I think with the opening and sort of empowerment of academia and elite cultural spaces, there's been kind of a reaction to that, a sense that if this was the thing that the oppressors embraced, it must be bad. It's and weirdly today, in the right academy, which is much smaller than the left academy, if there is such a thing as right-wing academic. And there is a kind of homologous, like a mirror movement in which there is a politically motivated embrace of traditional liberal education on the canon because the left woke hates it. And if the left woke hates the canon, it must be that the canon is like conservative and right wing. But it's not. It's just the same kind of movement. The canon is agnostic with respect to your political outcome. You can end up a right-wing nationalist or a communist from your reading and studying liberally. It doesn't, the liberal education doesn't answer those questions. It just allows you to think about it better. But a liberally educated right-winger and a liberal educated communist, I think is going to be, they're going to be much better communists and much better right-wingers than otherwise.
Is that what we want?
Maybe we have time for one more question, although we're fast approaching on 4 hours. If there's
I have
another
a
question,
question.
then talk
I have a
about it. Okay,
question
Tom,
for
get to
our
last question.
Friends, no, it's not me, this is.
Thank you.
This is Flanagan, our colleague Gordon Flanagan.
Crazy reaction.
Gordon Flanagan, hello.
Yeah, so he's on Zoom, he's Gordon's iPhone. I'm just gonna read it, I'm not gonna interpret it,
Okay.
okay? Would liberal education, that part of education not directed to vocations at the college level be better served by the abolition of specialized departments, which seem to exist more for the career needs of faculty and education students?
Yes, I believe in the abolition of academic departments. And you can have them like in graduate school or something, like, graduate professional schools, but in the undergraduate operation, departments don't make any sense, I think. Gordon,
Answer is no or yes. I forget how it was phrased, but
yes, I do think that, and some of the more enlightened,
liberal arts institutions don't have departments, right? Right, Tom?
St. John's?
sort of, yeah. The place I'm going to doesn't have quite departments, it has divisions, arts and letters and something like social sciences and natural sciences. So that's better than just this narrow departments in which people build careers by specialized research that is only of interest and relevance to other professionals in that field.
Is there an Eagle reporter in the room? It's line, the speaker called for abolition of the department. Trying to get us in trouble. All right.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.